right, let's take a stroll down memory lane. That's what I did as a child. That's the street that my grandparents lived on. Interesting, right? I remember walking down that street to the stream to skip stones. I quickly learned that bigger doesn't mean better. Big rocks, they don't skip. They just go thud. Rather, it's the smaller, flatter pebbles that skip the best. At first, I was able to take those pebbles and skip them in a way that created ripples that went the short distance across to the other side of the stream. Over time, with practice, I was able to create ripples that went further down the stream, much greater than that distance to the other side. Those ripples were impact, created from just one small pebble. In the same way, each of us can be that small pebble, creating ripples of impact on this earth, in our communities, and in our workplaces. As an in-house labor and employment lawyer, I focus on the impact that leaders have in the workplace. I'm a creative problem solver, like so many of you. Our leaders come to me with difficult employee situations, seeking advice and answers. They ask questions like, what are the options? What should I do? And sometimes even, why are they acting this way? What I have learned over time is that the answer to that why question might be because of trauma. So when I say that word trauma, it creates a shudder or chill that runs through us. Am I right? Trauma is hard stuff, physically and emotionally. Believe me, I know that from some of my own experiences. Trauma has become increasingly prevalent in our world and our workplaces. Research from the National Center for Well-Being shows us that 70% of adults in the United States have experienced trauma at least once in their life. So I first started noticing trauma in the workplace through investigations, where I was asked for advice and counsel. In one such situation, our employees had witnessed a horrific accident that involved the loss of life. Our investigator was trying to figure out what happened, but she wasn't getting answers. One witness just kept saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, to every question that was asked. Another had tears, broke down crying, sobbing, couldn't even answer a single question. The investigator came to me and said, what should I do? That got me thinking. I remembered other situations, similar questions by other investigators in past matters. Questions like, why can't they remember what happened? Why won't they just answer my question? Why won't they look at me? As I thought about those questions, I recognized the role and impact of trauma. So then I began wondering, what should we be doing? So I started researching and reading. After all, that's what we do as lawyers, right? I learned as much as I could about trauma and how it shows up in the workplace. So here are 3 key lessons I learned. First, trauma is not the bad event itself. Rather, trauma is the impact of the bad event on a person. The word trauma comes from a Greek word that means wound or injury. So trauma is the resulting wound, physical or emotional, that comes from the bad event or circumstances. It's not just what happened. It's how our bodies and our brains experience what happened. Now, not all of us experience the same bad event in the same way. Just think back to the early days of COVID, with all the talk of same storm, different boats. Sure, all of us were experiencing the same event, this global pandemic. But how we experienced COVID lockdowns differed among us based on resources and circumstances. When trauma is experienced, it can manifest on the outside. But more often than not, its real impact is on the inside. That led to the second lesson. Trauma impacts memory. All right, to unpack this one, I need to step back a little bit and talk about the brain. But first, a few disclaimers. I'm not a neuroscientist, and more importantly, brain science is still relatively new and evolving. We have learned so much, but we still have a lot to learn and understand. So back to that lesson. Trauma impacts memory. In its simplest terms, our brain has an upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs brain, commonly known as or referred to as the thinking brain, it is responsible for thinking, planning, problem solving, and reasoning. The downstairs brain, commonly referred to as our primitive brain, it is responsible for our basic bodily functions, things like our heart beating, our breathing, our eyes blinking. It's also responsible for processing sensory information and then helping keep us safe during bad events or threats. So the upstairs and the downstairs are connected by the amygdala, which acts as a gate between them. When a threat happens, that gate closes, which shuts down the connection from the upstairs to the downstairs. So what does this mean? Well, it means we're dealing with the downstairs brain when there is a bad or event or threat. That impacts what we perceive, what we notice, what we take in. It may also cause us to hyper-focus on certain aspects of what is going on, especially if safety is at issue. It also impacts encoding and storage, because that work is done by the upstairs brain. So then, when we try to recall what happened, our recollection can be jumbled and unreliable. So that's how trauma impacts memory, in those three very specific ways: perception, recall, encoding, and recall. This improved understanding of trauma and how it impacts our brains led to the third lesson. The traditional approach to legal investigations doesn't work when trauma is involved. Legal investigations are focused on and dependent upon memory. They review evidence and documents, they interview witnesses to collect memory-based information. They're trying to figure out what happened, usually putting events together in a logical, sequential, chronological order. That's what doesn't work, because that's the upstairs brain. So we need a new and different approach. Russell Strand, during his law enforcement work with the United States Army, gave us that approach. He called it the forensic experiential trauma interview. Strand says that investigators need to remember that when trauma is involved, they are only dealing with and interviewing the downstairs brain. So the investigator's job is to understand the entirety of the witness's experience as much as possible and draw out the fullest recollections that they can. This is different, way different than what we were taught in law school or legal trainings, where we were taught to start at the beginning and go chronologically, asking what's next and anything else over and over and over again. Those questions are linear, the sequencing that is stored in the upstairs part of the brain. That doesn't work when trauma is involved, because remember, we're dealing with the downstairs brain. So in a trauma-informed approach, what should investigators do? Well, first, they should start by creating a safe space, one that's private, comfortable, and distraction-free. Then they should use choices, giving the witness as much choice as possible, because choice helps the witness feel more in control. Choice can look like choice around when to meet, where to sit, or what even to start talking about. Investigators should also build rapport and watch for signs of trauma. More often than not, trauma is not visible. That's why it's so important to become trauma-informed. Trauma can show up in a variety of ways, and here are just a few examples. Nervousness, lack of focus, confusion or disorientation, exhaustion, blunt affect, withdrawn, and there are many others. So what I want folks to do is know to watch for changes, because it's changes in behavior or how people show up that can really be the indicator of the presence of trauma. So then investigators should use caring gestures, something like offering water as it helps the witness slow down and breathe, or offering an opportunity to doodle, as that can be calming and distracting. Then, here we get to the crux of it. Investigators should ask trauma-informed questions. These are questions that get at the witness's experience, not just their memory. So use statements or questions like, tell me what you remember. Start where you're comfortable. What else can you tell me about? Help me understand. Beyond these questions, investigators can ask questions designed to elicit sensory information. What did the witness see, feel, hear, touch, or taste? Remember, the downstairs brain processes and records sensory information. So these sensory questions will be much more effective than asking about cognitive facts. And here's the really fascinating thing. Gathering sensory information often unlocks other recollections. Let me say that one more time. Gathering sensory information often unlocks other recollections. That's what makes gathering sensory information such an incredibly powerful and effective tool when it comes to doing trauma-informed investigations. Last but not least, investigators should listen actively and genuinely use empathy. All right, so even if you're not a workplace investigator, you're probably a leader who will inevitably interact in the workplace with those who have or will experience trauma. Using a trauma-informed approach to those interactions can make you a more trustworthy and more effective leader. You can watch for signs of trauma and respond with gestures of care. You can show up and hold space and draw out the individual's experience, not just their memory. You can actively listen and use empathy. The energy with which you show up as a leader matters. Negative energy creates negative workspaces. Positive energy creates positive workspaces. When you show up with a calm, curious, empathetic presence, you are creating a trauma-informed workplace. That's impact, real, meaningful impact. It matters, and it changes lives. So when trauma is involved, memory lane is not necessarily an easy street to walk on. Certainly not as easy as that street I walked as a child. But what that street taught me was how to have great impact through growing ripples from small changes. One pebble, one person. Each of us can show up in ways that creates ripples and changes lives. Thank you.